Thanks very much, Jeff, and good morning, everyone. I also want to just acknowledge the Gumbaynggirr people on whose lands we're meeting and pay my respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. So I know for many of you, like me, this is your first conference, but I understand there are a number of repeat offenders here as well. And if you've been coming for a while, you'd know that the EPA has been a sponsor since the very beginning, back in 1996. And that's just a few years after the EPA was really created to try and reduce pollution across the state. And that was our big focus in those early years. But what I hope I can share a bit with you today, and I hope that you're starting to see in the EPA, is that our focus is really evolving. Yes, we're still trying to regulate those harmful things down and keep them at safe levels, but we're increasingly grappling with the critical contribution we need to make and government as a whole needs to make to also enable and breathe life into all of the new and innovative solutions and future sources of sustainable prosperity that we need as our society transitions. And of course, the circular economy is right at the heart of that. A safe circular net zero economy is a major transformation for society. It's not something any one government agency can sort of concoct alone, much less any one commercial player. It can only be achieved if we harness the collective wisdom and insight across the entire sector and beyond, frankly. And for my role leading the EPA, as long as I'm lucky enough to have this role, I want to make sure we are really leaning into that and making that easier in every way that we can. So today I just want to talk a bit about this epic 80% circular economy goal and the way we see the components of that journey being design standards, the collections process or distribution, technology and infrastructure, and markets. And I think across all of those foundational pieces, we're going to need to collaborate in new ways and obviously innovate as well. But if we do those things well, I think the prize is huge for the community and for our children and future generations, as well as our own economic well-being. So our statistics people tell me in 2021, we were diverting about 2/3 of our waste from landfill. And in construction and demolition, we're almost at 80%. For municipal waste, we're less than half, but nearly half, about 44%. And for commercial and industrial waste, a bit over half at 53%. And the last few years, those numbers have moved slowly up, but they're obviously nowhere near where we need to be. And a major focus for government from the last few years and into the next few years is going to be organics collection services, which obviously can make a big contribution to that municipal component. I know there's been a lot of talk about FOGO already, and there'll be a lot more talk to come, but I hope that as we move on that journey, we can help councils harness and keep what's working really well and just progress to that higher level of recovery also with high quality markets. So I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment too. But there's obviously a lot of other challenges beyond FOGO. Organics, plastics, paper and cardboard and timber is collectively about half of commercial and industrial waste. We've seen some real challenges with some of those streams, especially soft plastic, and the disappointing conclusions from the APCO work that those schemes are not effective, which obviously needs some further attention, and I'll touch on that in a moment too. But I guess I have a bit of a challenge, which is we've been talking about a waste industry and a waste event for many decades, but I actually think as an industry we need to shift that mindset away from waste and start thinking of ourselves as participants in the repurposing industry. I know some talk about resource recovery as well. Others think about it as a new frontier of almost resource extraction, a bit like mining, where we're sort of mining the resources in circulation. But if we're making that shift to a circular economy, I think our language is also important. So I think that's just worth thinking about as we engage with the community and other stakeholders. And I want to talk a little bit about the system that underpins that repurposing, which of course, has a central role for local government as the branch of government closest to the community that really can drive the social licence for some of what's required here, but also bring the insights from community perceptions directly to bear too. So just looking at those four components I talked about, the first one is design standards, and it's something that we haven't really focused enough on in Australia, in my view. We now have some legislative tools to do it. We're having some good conversations across governments, but in other jurisdictions, a lot of work has been done here over a couple of decades. In the EU, they estimate about 80% of the environmental impact of a product is actually determined in the design phase. And anyone who's worked in the sector understands that the best solution for any kind of pollution is not at the end of the pipe. I mean, you can do that, but it's much better to be in the designer's mind. I was amazed to read about a Dutch company called Fairphone that designs smartphones in modular components, so they're easier to repair. And just by extending the life of a phone by 2 years, they estimate they can reduce by about a third the embodied carbon in that device. So a lot of these design changes will come incrementally by innovation in business, but they're not going to come quickly enough unless they're supported with effective and efficient regulatory settings. So that's a real opportunity for us to collaborate on how do we think that through in terms of the value chain, and what does that start to look like in various products. In New South Wales, we've started on that journey through the single-use plastics focus with the Plastic Reduction Circular Economy Act that has some of these tools in it. And over the next 18 months, we're going to be looking to consult and work and engage with industry deeply across all of those remaining problematic plastic products and try and align on which ones are appropriate for design standards, which ones perhaps just need to be phased out because we have effective alternatives, which ones do we need to think harder about a stewardship scheme or some efficient program that covers the field that will keep them in circulation. Moving on to collections, obviously there's a big focus here in organics. We know that food and garden and textile waste is about half of the CO2 we generate in our municipal waste, and obviously the government's made some commitments around rolling out FOGO both for commercial businesses and for residential businesses. And it's great the EPA has been able to support some of that through grants, but I think the design of how that is implemented is equally critical that we need to collaborate on. So I know some councils have very strong markets already for these some of these products, and you want to maintain that. We don't want to see that contaminated or made less effective. We just want to build on that. So we need to keep working together to progress that. And then in terms of infrastructure and technology, we obviously need more data. It's always useful, I think, for industry to understand what the government sees the challenge is region by region. I think there's more the EPA can do there to work with the industry and other stakeholders in mapping that out and sharing it. That's one of the projects we're embarking on now, is a long-term waste infrastructure plan, which needs to be a co-designed plan that will have good quality data to allow investors to make well-informed decisions and also have the right kind of policy debates, because obviously this goes to social licence and the planning system and some of those other challenges too, and how do we best enable that. But the other side of that infrastructure coin is where the EPA, I think, sometimes, despite good intent, is making it harder rather than easier to innovate in some of these technologies. And so I was really pleased the EPA commissioned Cathy Wilkinson, former head of the Victorian EPA, to review our resource recovery framework. She's made a series of recommendations which we've adopted and endorsed, and I know there's going to be a presentation on that, I think, tomorrow. But at the heart of some of that is an innovation pathway, potentially some regulatory sandboxes or other tools that can allow development and demonstration and assessment of new innovative technology and processes. So I'm quite excited about that journey, and again, it's one that's going to require the wisdom of the entire sector to be effective. Quickly onto markets then. I know the EPA and councils have done a lot of work already on some of these FOGO markets, but I think we're government has a big role to play in the next few years is in our own procurement. I was very pleased to release the first protection of the environment policy earlier this year, which now requires proponents for infrastructure to outline how they're going to minimise embodied carbon and maximise recycled content in their proposal. And that will bind all consent authorities, so state assessment and planning approvals, but also local council approvals for infrastructure. As we work on developing that tool, we're going to trial it first on a few state roads, but you'll see in the next few years that coming to the fore in how procurement is considered. I think there's a lot more government can do there in developing markets. And again, we'll be consulting on that for the second half of the year, so I welcome any feedback on how we can get those settings right. And so when I think about what success looks like, one of the programs I was pleased to have been involved in a bit in a previous life 10 years ago was the initial stages of the Return and Earn Container Deposit Scheme. And obviously, there were a lot of challenges in bringing that to life, but I think its success, which is now undoubted, it's handled over 9 billion containers, more than twice the volume that was going through the bins, and it's, I think, generated almost $50 million for charitable donations. It's touched 90% of the community. It's a huge success in connecting people to recycling and enabling that circular economy because it delivers clean waste streams. We've seen new investments, new recycling plants built off the back of those streams. But it really works because the commercial incentives are aligned. Of course, it has a cost, but throwing waste in landfill also has a cost that was maybe less visible. So the trick in designing them is to make that cost as low as possible to be effective and efficient. And when we look at some of these other challenges, that's the right mindset, I think, to take. I'll quickly just touch on Red Cycle. I know it's been in the news a lot. The supermarkets are working with us now to safely recycle, and if they're not able to find a recycling solution here or offshore, ultimately it'll have to go to landfill, but to deal with these dangerous stockpiles. So it was very disappointing to see that scheme get to the point it was. It's almost a victim of its own success, and with COVID and the kind of commercial pressures that very small startup was put under. But I think there's a couple of lessons for me. One is that the whole value chain has a role to play in solving these challenges, and that includes the supermarkets who do a lot of their own packaging, but obviously the brands as well. But when you look at that outcome and the APCO conclusion in their own analysis that we're not going to hit those targets by a long stretch, it's clear that voluntary schemes struggle to be effective. And so when we think about solving these challenges, I think we need to think hard about what is the most cost-effective scheme that will be effective. And then finally, just on local government, I've talked a little bit about how they are critical partners for the state. I know we're going to have another presentation from one of my colleagues on the local council procurement service we're rolling out. I'm pleased we're rolling that out. There's a lot of opportunity there to help support councils to be more effective in how they negotiate these contracts and perhaps join up where there are synergies and savings for communities. Obviously, you need a lot of local alignment about the strategies there as well. But I'm pleased we're able to support councils in that way, and I hope we can do a lot more of that work going forward. So in my mind, just to sort of riff off our host from Coffs, who she said it's all about sort of slowly making progress. There's no one big solution. I think that's right. But if we can get the markets right and get the infrastructure that we need in place, the collection systems, and actually avoid the need for a lot of these other tools by having the right design standards, I think we can achieve this 80% goal and deliver a whole new wave of prosperity and jobs and investment too. And that's really the role I hope the EPA can help play and enable. Thank you very much.